Good. So welcome back to our series. So our series is based on conversation and the relation between libertarianism and conservatism, and it will endure for, well, it is enduring for 6 sessions. This is the second session, and it's going to be a talk. The rest are, well, as this one, standalone talks, except for the last one, who will be a debate. The series is co-organized by the Oxford Society of Metaphysics, which is a student association in the city of Oxford, dealing with interdisciplinary events, and Students for Liberty, which is a worldwide student association organizing events and campaigns on libertarian topics. So this session, as we said, will be recorded. And now I will give the word to Emanuele Martinelli, who is going to be tonight's moderator.
Thank you, Giuseppe, and thank you everybody for coming for our second session. And yes, Giuseppe said it would be our first of a series of standalone talks about different topics concerning the differences and similarities between libertarianism and conservatism. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that you're more than welcome to register in case you didn't do it on the website to be updated with all the remaining sessions of the series. And in addition to that, we also, as Students for Liberty, organize a lot of more events and activities like this. For instance, I wanted to mention that we're going live with our European conference in Madrid. It will be from April 24th to April 26th. So I will leave the link to the conference as well in the chat in case any one of you would like to join. Anyway, sorry for that. We have right now with us Simone Zuccarelli. Thank you very much for joining us today. He is the director of the Transatlantic Program at the Italian Atlantic Committee, an association dealing with studies on NATO and the US-EU relationships, and as well as a senior advisor of the Atlantic Treaty Association. In addition to that, he is also an adjunct professor at the Pegaso University, which is a telematic university in Italy, and also a teaching assistant at the Catholic University in Milan. So welcome with us, and you're free to take the floor. Sorry, I should mention that after the talk, we will have time for the Q&A, so you can use the raise your hand function or the chat when the time comes. So Simone, there you go.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. And I have to apologize in advance, as unfortunately I have a cold, so I'm not in a perfect shape, but I will do my best. In my speech, I will focus on the debate between liberty and virtue, because in my view, it best illustrates the differences between libertarians and conservatives and help explain the deeper reasons for the irreconcilability between the two. A preliminary clarification is, however, necessary. Speaking of libertarianism presents similar difficulties to those we encounter when using the term conservatism. Indeed, the label libertarian has, in the US, historically designated one of the wings of the so-called American conservative movement, a coalition that in reality encompassed a wide spectrum of positions ranging from classical liberals to libertarians stricto sensu, conservatives, anti-communists, and so on. A careful examination of the differences between classical liberalism and libertarianism would undoubtedly be of great interest. Such an inquiry, however, falls outside the scope of the present intervention. But we are lucky. Because even if we use the term libertarianism in the broad sense commonly adopted by historians of the so-called conservative movement in the US, this will not negatively impact the analysis. This is because, with regard to the liberty/virtue dichotomy, classical liberals and libertarians are substantially aligned. Indeed, libertarians have pushed the primacy of liberty even further, radicalizing the commitment to individual autonomy and market freedom. Consequently, while aware of the conceptual distinction involved, I will use libertarianism as a heuristic category to designate the philosophy that elevates liberty as supreme principle. As I told at the beginning, among the debates that have most significantly shaped the history of the American right in general, and American conservatism in particular, is undoubtedly the discussion regarding the relative importance of liberty and virtue within a given worldview. From the moment right-wing thought, let's say right-wing thought, began to occupy significant spaces, the clash over this dyad has never ceased, and has strongly contributed to defining the characteristics assumed by the various currents within the so-called conservative movement. In particular, while the libertarian wing primarily promoted the idea of liberty in all its forms, the conservatives placed virtue as the center of their system of thought. This led to a substantial conflicts between the two currents and to the impossibility of finding a point of fusion. In the post-Cold War period, these differences re-emerged with force, and the progressive ascendancy of the conservative vision, correctly understood, has marked and increasingly continues to mark the positions of the Republican Party and the president who represent it. However, a significant conceptual and semantic problem must be addressed before proceeding with an examination of the debate. Firstly, it is necessary to clarify that in post-war America, the term traditionalists began to be used instead of conservatives, since during the 30s the label conservative had been applied to the portion of politicians and civil society that had united in opposition to Roosevelt's New Deal. This heterogeneous grouping lacked a shared vision, but its ideas generally leaned toward classical liberalism or libertarianism, as the opposition to Roosevelt was largely based on hostility toward the centralization of power in the federal government and what was perceived as an attempt to collectivize the economy. Nevertheless, since the term liberal had increasingly been used to refer to social democratic policies, opponents of Roosevelt adopted conservative with the intention of presenting themselves as defenders of traditional American freedoms. In doing so, however, they created a significant conceptual and semantic confusion that persists to this day. This confusion was further intensified from the 1950s onward with the introduction of the concept of conservative movement, within which, as we said before, currents with profoundly different worldviews were included. The common ground between them, the fight against communism. The term conservatism, therefore, largely ceased to be employed in its original sense, namely to refer to a precise worldview that originated in Europe in response to the French Revolution. Consequently, conservative came to signify, depending on the figure or the current under examination, a reactionary, a traditionalist, a classical liberal, a libertarian, anti-communist, and so on. So it became synonymous with the right in general and was used in place of, for instance, classical liberal, despite the fact that thinkers that identified as traditionalists continued to use conservatism correctly to define their own views. In recent years, various efforts have been made to restore the original unequivocal meaning of conservatism in the United States, but not only, and exploring the debate between liberty and virtue and the specific form of liberty and virtue is essential not only to better understand the history and the present of the American right, but also to clarify the distinctions between conservatism and libertarianism. As in case of the term libertarianism, I will initially use traditionalism in the sense employed by historians of the conservative movement in order to create as little confusion as possible. Only later, once the topic has been adequately explored, I will adopt the term conservatism. So, the question is, what are the origins of the debate between liberty and virtue? Although many currents and subcurrents have emerged over time within the American right, two, libertarian and traditionalists, have been in dialogue since the post-war era, beginning with the debate on liberty and virtue. The confrontation between these two factions, we can say, ignited from the very early stages of the rise of the so-called conservative movement. Initially, the leading figures of the American right were almost entirely linked to the libertarian vision and the opposition to the New Deal. This development was also facilitated by the dissemination in the 40s of crucial work defending liberty, such as The Road of Serfdom, Omnipotent Government, and Human Action. Not to mention the homegrown writings of Albert J. Nock, who would serve as a point of reference for the post-World War II American right. As George Nash notes, the immigration of several European intellectuals contributed to strengthening the libertarian current of the American right. These thinkers, despite partial divergence in their views, shared the conviction that liberty in all its forms should occupy the center of their political philosophical system. To achieve this, they advocated a reduction of government and bureaucracy, promoted the free market as the best solution to economic problems, elevated individuals and their freedom above society, and believed that this would lead to an advancement of human condition. However, the predominance of the libertarian current did not remain uncontested. By the late 40s, the work of several authors, most notably Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, and Richard Weaver, emerged, heralding a different vision, soon labeled traditionalist vision. According to these thinkers, while liberty was undoubtedly important, it had to be subordinated to the pursuit of virtue, never elevated to an abstract or absolute principle, and always situated within a broader metaphysical order. Similarly, the individuals were important, for sure, but not to the extent of being placed above the society to which they belonged. At the foundation of this vision lay the values inherited from Western tradition, like meshing of virtue, liberty, religion, society, and the individual. The significant distinction between the two currents, so libertarian and traditionalist, quickly became evident. In Ideas Have Consequences, published in 1948 by Richard Weaver, there is a clarification of the term of this issue. For a conservative, Weaver said, the enemy could only be modernity, and consequently, his model could never be the materialistic society promoted by, for instance, Northern capitalism, Weaver said, but rather the Old South, quote, the last non-materialist civilization in the Western world, end quote. The declared goal, therefore, for Weaver, was a return to the values of the past. Quote, in declaring that we wish to recover lost ideals and values, we are looking toward an ontological realm which is timeless. Only the sheerest relativism insists that passing time renders unattainable one ideal while forcing upon us another. End quote. So Weaver attacked the bourgeoisie mentality, arguing that it conveyed the false idea that politics should be merely ancillary to the economy. In contrast, Weaver believed that the economic man needed to be dethroned. This vision was soon shared by Russell Kirk. In particular, the year following the publication of Conservative Mind, so in 1954, Kirk illustrated his intellectual sympathies in a program for conservatives. In this book, he launched a strong critique of the ideas promoted by the libertarian wing of the American right. Firstly, he associated the accumulation of wealth with a form of human decay, emphasizing that, quote, confounding prosperity with strength and virtue is so perilous an error indeed that on most occasions it will undermine material success long before the anticipated prosperity is attained, end quote. He further recalled that the glorification of materialism and the abandonment of principles had paved the way for the victory of the communist enemy, thus criticizing capitalism as utilitarian and consumeristic. Most importantly, Kirk decisively attacked the individualist vision characteristic of certain segments of the American right. According to Kirk, again I'm quoting, the enlightened conservative always has stood for true community, the union of men through love and common interest for the common welfare. It was the liberals and the radicals of the 18th and 19th centuries not the conservatives, who did everything in their power to abolish the traditional concept of community." End quote. This critique of what he called the conservatively inclined circles focused on their subordination of the logic of efficiency, utility, and success, placing the economy above all else. In the first edition of the book I quote before, Kirk also directly criticized libertarian great thinkers such as Mises. Overall, he emphasized that conservatism is a system of ideas fundamentally opposed to liberalism. The Costa intellectual said that the best way to cultivate a serene and virtuous human being was to respect ancient values and reject the grotesque, massified world. The critique of the libertarian current could have not been clearer, and the response was swift. In 1955, the same year as the first issue of National Review was published, Frank Meyer, a leading intellectual of the emerging New Right, launched a sharp attack on Russell Kirk, essentially labeling him a disguised collectivist. Meyer's main criticism of Kirk was that he did not sufficiently oppose the gradual strengthening of state and bureaucracy. Furthermore, Kirk's constant denunciation of individualism, according to Meyer, revealed his inability to understand the nature of a free society. It is therefore unsurprising that Meyer also attacked Edmund Burke. Kirk, for his part, despite his ongoing contribution to National Review, eventually had his name removed from the masthead to avoid appearing alongside intellectuals he despised as hyper-individualists, particularly Meyer and Chodorov. That thinker with such divergent position could be considered part of the same conservative movement can be explained only in light of two significant dynamics. First one, the existential threat posed by Soviet communism. Second, the fusionist effort promoted precisely by Frank Meyer and several other intellectuals inspired by his positions. After his harsh critique of Kirk, Meyer gradually softened his stance. He continued to view libertarians and traditionalists as separate, but no longer in stark opposition. On the contrary, he increasingly saw them as two currents within the same grouping, the conservative movement. This effort culminated in the publication in 1964 of What is Conservatism? That is considered basically the Federalist Papers of American Conservatism, edited by Frank Meyer himself. The volume, which collected contributions from the leading minds of the right at the time, Kirk, Kendall, Hayek, Chodorov, and Buckley, aimed to demonstrate that points of agreement between the two currents outweighed points of disagreement, which were regarded as simple differences of emphasis. Moreover, Meyer said that, quote, virtue not freely chosen isn't virtuous, and individualism absent morality is an invitation to chaos, end quote. The ultimate goal was not only philosophical, but also practical, the unification of forces in the struggle against, quote, liberal collectivist body of dogma that has pervaded the consciousness and shaped the action of decisive and articulate section of society over the past half century or more. So basically, the final goal was the fight against communism. However, the volume, despite representing a significant intellectual effort, also revealed the failure of this ambitious project. On one end, Kirk opened his essay by reaffirming this position. Quote, civilized man lives by authority. Without just authority and respected prescription, the pillars of any tolerable civil social order, true freedom is not possible. End quote. On the other hand, even more emblematic in my opinion, was the inclusion in the volume of a famous essay by Hayek on the topic, Why I Am Not a Conservative, originally published in 1960 as a postscript to the Constitution of Liberty. The essay is a severe critique of conservatism. According to Hayek, conservatives, at least in part of Europe, had already accepted much of the collectivist creed, and more generally, he believed that conservatives had more often followed socialists than liberals. Furthermore, the Austrian thinker refused to consider himself conservative, as he did not appreciate the fear of change characteristic of conservatives, their attachment to authority, or their skepticism toward democracy. In conclusion, he understood and accepted, even if he did not fully endorse, the use of the term libertarian to describe position of those, like him, who were essentially classic liberals, and he further stuck at conservative, asserting, quote, "I doubt whether there can be such a thing as a conservative political philosophy. Conservatism may often be a useful practical maxim, but it does not give us any guiding principle which can influence long-range developments." IXA is clear regarding the profound differences between liberal and conservative visions. Yet, this did not prevent many scholars and commentators, even recently, from including the Austrian economist among conservatives. It is evident that fusionism, although never fully successful in bridging the divergences between libertarians and traditionalists, or conservatives, contributed to the affirmation of the idea, quote, that from Frank Meyer to William Buckley to George Will, indeed to Ronald Reagan, there is a strain of libertarianism endemic to conservatism, end quote. By the late 50s, it was therefore not the conservative attitude of Weaver, Kirk, and Nisbet that prevailed in the American right, but the fusionist creed, which progressively spread in political, think about the campaign of Goldwater, and philosophical context, even if not all accepted these premises. Brent Bozell, for example, offered one of the clearest and most uncompromising contributions to this topic. In Freedom or Virtue, published in National Review 1962, Bozell argued that an alliance between traditionalists and libertarians was undesirable, as the libertarians were responsible to the root causes of Western disintegration. The opposing position was supported, among others, by Milton Friedman in 1965 at the first conference of the Philadelphia Society. The organization had been established the previous year precisely to foster debate within American right and encourage rapprochement between libertarians and traditionalists. In reality, while the debate would remain open, frank, and of high quality, neither current would fully embrace the idea of fusion, instead continuing to advocate its respective positions. Friedman clarified at the outset that he would speak as a liberal, so as someone who, quote, believes in individual freedom as a central problem in social organization, end quote. In particular, he highlighted the distance of his position from that of the traditionalists, as he believed values should be determined in the free market of ideas. Even Meyer on that occasion could only observe, quote, "I can only say that I think Milton Friedman and I must have a very, very, very different view of the kind of problem our society faces at this point in history." So basically, even the fusionist one was quite skeptical to be able to reach real fusion. Events organized by the Philadelphia Society on the theme of conservatism occurred regularly and are extremely useful for tracing the debate on liberty and virtue. In 1971, for instance, a conference titled Liberals and Conservatives Revisited featured a presentation by Irving Kristol, the godfather of the neoconservative movement, who offered a series of provocative observations. In particular, Kristol argued that he could not define himself as a conservative in the sense that the term was used in America at the time. According to Kristol, the term has come to represent precisely Milton Friedman's position, who nevertheless continued to define himself as a liberal. The position is an extended laissez-faire not only in economy but also in individual spheres. Kristol observed, however, that such a vision would have been considered irresponsible by a 19th century classical liberal, precisely the vision Friedman claimed to support. For the godfather of neoconservatism, the 19th century liberal would have supported the importance of religion and state intervention to sustain it, as well as the introduction of strict laws to punish deviant behavior. Essentially, Crystal rejected the conservatism associated with Friedman because it did not truly endorse, quote, the ideal of free enterprise in a free society as much as Mr. Friedman does, end quote. And above all, because Crystal considered this form of so-called conservatism self-defeating. Crystal said, it does not lead to a tranquil life, but rather leads to social convulsions. A particularly interesting aspect of Crystal's analysis is, in my opinion at least, is his reflection on the conservative ethos, which essentially aligns his thought not only with the traditionally current, but also with the European conceptions of conservatism. Quote, I have little doubt that this may sound bizarre to those who believe that happiness consists in the incessant satisfaction of desires. If you are a conservative, however, you will not find it hard to believe that happiness has more to do with a fond attachment to familiar things and to familiar ways. To the extent that such familiarity is disrupted by rapid economic improvement, as measured by economists and statisticians, people became anxious, uneasy, suspicious, aggressive, neurasthenic. Despite the terminological and semantic confusion of the period, fueled, as seen even by Crystal himself, a more classical, non-strictly American meaning of the term conservative consistently emerged. Another notable debate on the issue occurred in 1979. Robert Nisbet's contribution is particularly instructive. Notably, he did not use the term traditionalist and libertarian to indicate two presumed souls of conservatism, but correctly, he distinguished between conservatives and libertarians as two distinct currents of thought. The proximity of certain issues did not justify, in Nisbet's idea, speaking of libertarian conservatives or conservative libertarians, as the differences between the two worldviews were too significant. During the Reagan years, despite the political triumph of fusionism, the sharp conflict between libertarians and traditionalists, or we can now say between conservatives and libertarians, persisted. In particular, 2 years after Nisbet's comments, one of the most severe critiques of libertarianism was launched by a well-known conservative since the inception of the liberty-virtue debate. Indeed, in 1981, Russell Kirk published Libertarian, the Chirping Sectarians, asserting that conservatives and libertarians shared only an hatred of collectivism and, like Nisbet, he rejected the use of the term traditionalists, thereby implying the existence of a single conservatism of which libertarians were not a component. Kirk stated, quote, incidentally, now and again, one reads of two camps of alleged conservatives, traditionalist conservatives and libertarian conservatives. This is as if a newspaperman were to classify Christians as Protestant Christians and Muslim Christians. And then he said, a libertarian conservative is as rare a bird as a Jewish Nazi. Was quite a bit strong in this declaration, but the depth of the conflict originates from Kirk's view that libertarians were progeny of Mill, with a, quote, fanatic attachment to a simple, solitary principle, that is, to the notion of personal freedom as the whole hand of civil social order, and indeed of human existence, end quote. He further attacked the idea of a possible alliance between conservatives and libertarians, as he believed the line of division in modern politics lay between those who believed in a certain form of transcendental order and those who, conversely, quote, take this ephemeral existence of ours to be devoted chiefly to producing and consuming, end quote. Also, he revisited the critique of materialism and the notion of the free market as the guiding principle of human action. Moreover, he argued that libertarians prioritized abstract liberty in their reflections, while conservatives understood that, quote, in any society, order is the first need of all, end quote. Kirk's critique was so profound that he even suggested that an alliance, even if it sounds absurd, between conservatives and socialists would have been more conceivable than an alliance between conservatives and libertarians, since socialists, quote, at least declare the existence of some sort of moral order. The libertarians are quite bottomless, end quote. In 1986, one of Robert Nisbet's final work, Conservatism, Dream and Reality, clarified the meaning of conservatism and its relationship with liberty, the state, society, and virtue. Nisbet recalled the Burkean origins of conservatism and emphasized the importance of history, tradition, prejudice, authority, liberty, property, religion, and morality for this system of thought. In particular, although conservatives cared about liberty and the defense of private property, Nisbet noted that, quote, an important aspect of the conservative philosophy of property in modern history consists in the frequent critique of capitalism, industrialism, commerce, and technology, a vision clearly incompatible with libertarian or even classical liberal sentiment. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of communism as a global ideological threat that brought to the fore the contradiction and divergences within the American right. Early signs appeared with the growing discontent toward the Bush senior administration during his 4-year tenure, which fully manifested itself in 1992 electoral campaign, when Patrick Buchanan challenged the party and the conservative movement for the leadership against the moderates. Over time, Buchanan had increasingly become the voice of the paleo-conservative faction, which drew on the anti-New Deal and isolationist battles of the old right, combining these with nativist, nationalist, and the defense of Judeo-Christian roots of the United States. According to Buchanan, quote, before true conservatives, see how he's used true conservatives, can ever take back the country, they are going to have to take back their movement, end quote. And this was precisely what Buchanan sought to achieve. The difference between Buchanan's approach and Bush's became evident from the very announcement speech of their candidacy. Buchanan began with a direct critique of the theorist of the end of history. While the speech contained the usual attacks on welfare state, bureaucracy, and excessive taxation, its novelty lay in elevating culture as the central theme of the campaign. It was under Buchanan that the rhetoric defending Judeo-Christian values is, in an increasingly perceived corrupt world, the decisive attack on multiculturalism and the elevation of order as a supreme value emerged. During the campaign, Buchanan frequently leveraged on conservative themes that, in years to come, would become increasingly common, almost taken for granted in Republican communication, culminating in their full embrace under Donald Trump. Despite the relative success in the primaries, it was nearly impossible for Buchanan to defeat the incumbent president, George Bush Sr. His influence, however, was clearly visible at the Republican convention in Houston in August 1992. After offering his endorsement to Bush, Buchanan delivered the famous address, later called the Culture War Speech, which contributed to the GOP's gradual reorientation toward culture and values-driven battles, themes later extensively adopted by Trump. In particular, Buchanan launched a sharp attack on the pro-life movement, LGBTQ+ activism, pornography, feminism, calling for the defense of the God's country. A particular notable element of the speech was the citation of Edmund Burke as an intellectual reference, clearly linking his to the form of conservatism promoted above all by Russell Kirk. It is therefore no coincidence that Kirk supported Buchanan in the 1992 primaries. Despite sustained criticism of Buchanan from various Republican figures throughout the 90s, the American right gradually moved toward the position proposed by traditionalists, a vision echoed by Buchanan himself. Although debates on the meaning of conservatism continued, including attempts to expel Buchanan from the movement as not conservative, George W. Bush's victory in 2000 serves as clear evidence of the ongoing transition. Bush's compassionate conservatism did not satisfy all factions of the right, in particular libertarians, that accused him of abandoning economic conservative principles or of being simply a big government conservative. This criticism, however, holds only if conservatism is understood as it was during the Cold War, basically a strand of thought that elevates liberty as founding principle or as a synonym of classic liberalism. Conservatives, for example, offered little objection to Bush's domestic policies, while Buchanan's faction, despite negative judgment regarding what was seen as an excessive emphasis on government, primarily attacked Bush on foreign policy, free trade, immigration, and for not having, quote, emphasized social, moral, and cultural issues to the degree he should have. Donald Trump's rise gave further voice to those who prioritize virtue and order over the idea of liberty, reviving a vision long presenting conservatism, including in the American context, as expressed by thinkers such as Kirk and Weaver, but which has followed, especially in the United States, a subterranean trajectory until recent years. This trajectory is one that is profoundly critical of liberalism and its economic, social, cultural, and institutional outputs. This applies both intellectually and politically. In the intellectual sphere, one of the driving force behind the assault on the primacy of liberty is the so-called post-liberal movement. According to post-liberals, the elevation of liberty as the supreme principle in the West has produced disastrous economic and social consequences. Trump's victory, however, marked the beginning of a new era. Several intellectuals signed in 2019 what can be considered the manifesto of post-liberalism. According to them, quote, there is no returning to the pre-Trump conservative consensus that collapsed in 2016. And look at the fact that they still use conservative consensus to talk about this conservative movement, union of liberals, conservatives, and so on. I continue the quote. Any attempt to revive the failed conservative consensus that preceded Trump would be misguided and harmful for the right. End quote. That consensus, they said, is subordinated to the idea of individual autonomy, pay lip service to traditional values, but it failed to retard, much less reverse, the eclipse of permanent truth, family stability, communal solidarity, and much else. End quote. The fundamental idea of post-liberals is essentially to restore the model of society dear to traditionalists, thereby placing virtue above freedom. Above all, their attack is not limited to progressivism. The criticism of a certain libertarian right is equally strong. One of the movement's main thinkers, Patrick Deneen, believes that liberalism has failed and must be replaced. In particular, he attacks the so-called conservatives for having supported, quote, the liberal free market while claiming to support family values that unfettered capitalism undermines, end quote. An indicator capable of showing the penetration of these ideas into the intellectual world is the position taken in recent years by the Heritage Foundation. Despite having adopted a libertarian line on economic issues throughout its whole history, this is increasingly less the case. The president of the think tank argued, for example, that, quote, we all love the free market, but the free market is at service of the family and at the service of the nation, end quote. According to Kevin Roberts, it is time for conservatives to reduce the emphasis placed on the free market. He also believes that it's necessary to make libertarians understand that there are excesses of the free market and that the state can be used to counteract them. In conclusion, it is evident that the debate between freedom and virtue, initially won by those who elevated the former over the latter within the American right, it is in this debate, it is the conservatives who are increasingly shaping the position of the American right and the Republican Party. In particular, the two Trump presidency have greatly accelerated this dynamic, which is profoundly altering the US political and intellectual landscape. More than economic issues, It is above all cultural and value-based questions that have dominated and animated the electorate in recent years, with the Grand Old Party having now adopted almost all the positions long expressed by conservatives. An illustration of the ongoing transformation is the comparison between Barry Goldwater acceptance speech and Donald Trump's, as this clarifies how the emphasis on certain themes has been substantially reversed. If, for example, the word liberty appears 6 times and the word freedom 23 times in Goldwater 1964 speech, in Trump's 2016 acceptance speech, liberty does not appear at all, and freedom appears only once, to denounce the trade agreement signed by the United States. In 2024, 2 times for freedom, 1 for liberty. In compensation, far greater emphasis is placed on themes dear to conservatives, a clear sign of the transformation underway and of the, at least temporary, prevalence of the traditionalist vision over the libertarian one in the decade-long debate between freedom and virtue, from virtue to liberty and back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Simone, for the very interesting talk. So right now, I think it is a good time to open the Q&A to the audience. So in case anyone has any question, you can either raise your hand or write in the chat. For now, we have compliments. Otherwise, I will break the ice maybe with a question. And yeah, pretty much I think you summed it up very profoundly. But I wanted then to challenge you to the very recent, I don't know, contemporary like evolutions that we see in American conservatism and libertarianism, maybe. I remember Professor Marco Bassani from the University of Milan, that I know you know well, saying that for context, he's an expert in American history and politics. And he said that especially with the Trump-Clinton election in 2016, we had a moment in American politics where you could observe that maybe so remarkably, for the first time in history, we were seeing American politics becoming more and more like European politics. We had people like Bernie Sanders that were describing themselves as socialists. We now have Zoran Mamdani, for instance. And we had, on the other hand, like Trump, and now we could say Vance and Rubio, probably, that are conservative in the American sense, but increasingly also maybe in a more European sense, because I don't want to say that they are white nationalists and they're racist, because I know that's lowballing, but there is truth to say that they maybe are thematizing the very European idea that you should conserve the traditions, the national identity of your country, your culture. Whereas traditionally, you correct me if I'm wrong, in the US, you see that usually there is no such I know stress on the cultural history of the place. It's just I know the culture is very individualistic. There is no much consensus over a national identity. Just I don't know, maybe values and ways of life, but that's fairly different. But at the same time, and that's what I wanted to understand here, we see that Trump in the second mandate is also I don't know, collaborating with big tech companies and people like Sam Altman recently or Elon Musk in the recent past that, well, at least until a few months ago, probably they were describing themselves as, I don't know, libertarians or proto-libertarians in a sense. So what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is a crucial topic also. First of all, I totally agree with your first part of the analysis. This is also what I was telling to a friend of mine that is a director of a think tank in the US. And I was saying it seems to me that the Republican Party, or at least the right in the US, is becoming more and more European. So it's more nationalistic, it's more focused on, a certain kind of nativism regarding migration. Also, from an economic point of view, there is this emergent post-liberal movement for sure, but even J.D. Vance, if you read, for instance, what J.D. Vance wrote and said in interviews, he often attacked big companies, saying that big companies are, damaging the middle class in America, lower class. They attack free trade. This is, for instance, a very relevant feature, because usually we have in mind that the Republican Party is the party of free trade and also liberalism in economy. But if you think about, for instance, the Republican Party of the 19th century, they were protectionists. And also in Europe, conservatism was protectionist in economy. So the conservatism of Disraeli, they were protectionists. So it seems to me that there is this penetration of European, let's say, conservatism in the American mind. And this was started by Russell Kirk, because Russell Kirk was the first that said, we have to look at Edmund Burke. Okay, he was an Anglo-Saxon, true, but still an European. And also Russell Kirk also thought about other Europeans, European conservatives. And this penetration of, let's say, European conservatism started in the 50s in the US and slowly took the movement. The second half is also very interesting, because still we have in the right these different strands. So libertarians are still strong, especially with economy, big tech, big donors, and so on. The Koch brothers, for instance, they were huge. They remain libertarians. Elon Musk, for sure, and but I have to say that, for instance, also in this kind of peculiar world of Silicon Valley, for instance, Peter Thiel, yes, he described himself as a libertarian, but still is saying that the state should do something. For instance, investing a lot in big tech, in technology, in the development of technology, into preserving the edge that divides the US and the other competitors. So my take is that even this kind of, let's say, libertarians like Thiel are not libertarians like in the, as we are, as we know. They want that, for instance, less welfare, less bureaucracy, that's fine, but they are totally in favor of a state that intervene, for instance, in the promotion of technology, or in a state that works to preserve the strategic superiority of the US against, for instance, China. In the last years, still is saying a lot that we have to, fight back against China, and so the state has to do something. And if you think that now the Claude Anthropic decided not to help the Pentagon with his software, but Thiel is for sure so much in favor to receiving public funds, because he says that Palantir is a perfect instrument to protect US superiority in the fight against China. So no problem if the state is working in this direction. So I think that this belief that the primacy of the individual, without too much concerns for, let's say, moral values, and also certain kind of idea of the sacred, is receding a lot. So even the libertarian part. And for sure, from the philosophical point of view, I see less and less libertarianism in the US and more, let's say, traditional conservatism, European conservatism.
Yeah, I agree. Which is not necessarily a good thing, if you ask me. But yeah. And right. I'm pausing here in case anybody wants to jump in. But yeah, I don't know if you worked on that particularly, but I also wanted to know where would you situate objectivism in this framework in the US? Because objectivism was born in the US, of course, very tied to traditional American values. At the same time, Ayn Rand in particular was keen on developing a philosophy that could back up, well, conservative politics in the sense of, free market politics that is a little bit also tied to objective morality and the defense of objective morality. And whereas Ayn Rand is, for many, many points, actually anti-government and laissez-faire in economics, she also depicted herself as anti-libertarian as well. So where would you situate her and the movement?
That's a really, really interesting and difficult question. I want just to comment on something that is in the chat now. That is, it's the same with conservatism. So I think it's very, very interesting that the Paraskevas, I think, said that if everyone is a libertarian and one is, we need to take the liberal label from the social dems and give it back to the classic liberal. That's, I think it's a crucial point from, let's say, philosophical point of view, but also from a definition of concepts and theories. It's crucial because in the US, everyone use liberals, and they are not liberals, they are social democrats. And the fact that they started using liberals forced the liberals, the real liberals, to use conservatives. So there is a total confusion. So if the libertarians or at least classic liberals are able to claim back this word, maybe we can have more, let's say, less confusion in the terminology. So I totally agree with the one that commented in the chat. Regarding what you were saying, I think that this also Rothbard was, and so at the end of his life, against libertarians. So it seems that a lot of significant thinkers of the libertarians strand of thoughts were against libertarians, maybe for
Nozick as
different.
well. Nozick as well.
Nozick as well. So it's this is curious for sure, and I think that, for instance, okay, in my opinion, what Rothbard did was closer to, you find a way to find, a way to have an alliance between libertarians and conservatives, because the issue is that the problem with objectivism and Rand, in my opinion, and probably let's say having a voice inside this America or an alliance with conservatism, is the relation, first of all, the relationship with God, so with the sacred. And it will be very difficult for a conservative, even if it's not, let's say, a traditional Christians, to accept a worldview that, is not focusing on the sacred and on the transcendental moral order. This could be, let's say, problematic in my opinion. But Rothbard tried something like that, because Rothbard at the end, this was, in my opinion, is another very interesting topic, when he said we have to create paleo-libertarians. So in a certain moment at the end, Rothbard said, okay, libertarianism without a certain kind of moral order just becomes libertinism. And libertinism is like nihilism, and so it's the loss of everything. So Rothbard said, yes, we should continue to put liberty at the top priority, but at the same time, we have to focus on also, he said, conservatives have they are saying something that is correct. So the fact that we need, for instance, to preserve a certain kind of morality, a correct vision of art, and so on. So that kind of approach, in a certain sense, could work, but at the end it failed. So it's still an attempt that can be done. Objectivism and basically Rand vision, I think that it could be. I don't think that he will be able, he could be able to find a way to create an alliance between these two worldview. It will for sure remain in contrast, but this is
right. I see.
Well, I was curious to ask something also connected to what Paraskevas, I think, wrote on the chat. I think it's the heart of your discussion about virtue and politics specifically declined in the conservatism and libertarianism. I was out. Well, what do you think about the affirmation, the statement that conservatism is a sort of mild socialism,
I
and
saw that. Yeah, I
well,
wanted to reply.
and there's a sort of well, I'm quite passionate about Roger Scruton. I have
Mhm,
to say that he would reply in that case that what is supposed by conservatism is just supposing some moral limits on markets.
mhm,
The law should not enforce in a way should enforce probably the minimum duties that make liberty possible. Probably it is what he would say. That means order, trust, contracts. But virtue, I think, according to a conservative perspective, cannot be manufactured by coercion. It is not something that is, how could I say, that could be cultivated through it's well, it is probably something that could be cultivated through costumes and civil society.
mhm.
But I have the impression that that statement, probably it's too harsh. What do you think?
No, I think that it's funny because the statement "conservatives are just slightly better socialists anyway" as something that is, in a certain sense, true. What do I mean? For instance, Roger Scruton said he said there is a truth in socialism, as there is truth in liberalism, in nationalism, in internationalism, and so on. So, in a certain sense, it's not a false statement, because for conservatives, society exists, and so the fact that individuals are not just small atoms that go around, but there is a society that has a certain kind of structure and reality by itself. So in a certain way there is a little bit of socialism inside. Also, if you think that the first conservatives were in favor of some welfare state, so also there is this kind of idea that the state should help the weak inside the society, so should do something. So it's not, obviously I would not say that conservatism is a bit socialist in the sense of socialism as a political theory, because here we are in two different worlds. Okay, but just that there is a society and the individuals should not be put up above society. That's yes. I have to say also that in my opinion, and this could be maybe strong, it's in the chat, it's just individualism versus collectivism. This is very nice. It's really a nice debate what is going on in the comments, what is going on in the chat, because in my opinion is exactly what happened during the debate. So we are like living in the real moment what was happening during the Cold War in the US. So a lot of people said exactly this: there is individualism or collectivism. There is no middle ground. You have to choose. And this is why the fracture between conservatism and libertarianism at the end was totally impossible to reconcile, even despite a lot of efforts. Because there is this idea that, on one end, if you start to think about community, start to think that the state should do something, you are basically a collectivist. Like Mayer told Kirk. On the opposite side, they said that if you are only individualist, society is done. So you will lose moral order at the end, you will lose everything. So it's really difficult to reconcile these two strands of thoughts. Um, but I lost in in my thinkings, and maybe I lost your questions. You were saying, okay, socialism, Scruton, and then
Yes, I mean, if what did you think about the statement that was made about conservatism as a sort of what he says that you cannot enforce morality without enforcing
yes.
economy.
Yeah, that's a really another very interesting point. I think that it's true. For conservatives, you, at least in my opinion, obviously, and for what I read, it's not that they want to enforce a certain code, moral code, uh, to the individual, but to the society, it's a different thing. So I try to explain this. So a conservative would never tell you, you have to believe this. But at the same time, he could say, okay, let's use the state to promote a certain kind of idea of virtue. So this is possible. So for instance, it's like an example of the ancient Rome with mos maiorum. Yes, you could be free to ignore this, but the result would be you would be ostracized by society. You would be put aside. So if you violated mos maiorum, you would have been considered like, I don't know, a coward, and something like that. So for conservatives, I think there is a idea that the state could try to at least promote a vision of virtue, promote a transcendent moral order, and try to push people in that direction without enforce directly the individual. But there is a distinction, in my opinion. Not with the individual, yes, trying to use the state to convey a certain kind of values and a code, a moral code.
If I got right, it's well, I would describe it as a sort of way not to divide things just in, libertarian that are individualistic and conservatives that are collectivist. I have the impression that something more fine grained. It is what emerge. Because in a way,
Yeah,
you cannot think about individuals which are completely disconnected by society. Because unfortunately, when we think about virtue and about things like that, we cannot start just from individuals thinking about virtues as something that is completely separated from what it happens later when these individuals meet. I mean, it's a sort of division that we cannot do in a in a could I say an ontological way. You cannot think
yeah,
about virtue, which is individual, and after virtue that becomes social. But these things are necessarily connected, even if I admit or I don't admit it. So
yeah,
when I see this contrast that, according to some people, uh, they have this contrast between libertarian philosophy and conservative philosophy, just as a contrast between individualism and collectivism. I have some doubts, actually.
Mhm.
I
Also, because if I may, there is an interesting point, I think, because, for instance, if you think that usually this idea of individualism and collectivism is often related also to economy. So, and if you think that liberalism and, let's say, socialism, let's call collectivism as you want, there is a huge, let's say, focus on the economic domain, both in liberalism, libertarianism, and in socialism. On the contrary, conservatives will say, yes, I care about economy, but not so much. So I focus more on, let's say, transcendent moral order, God, sacred, virtue, so but more philosophical issues. Economy is of secondary importance. On the contrary, I think that many, not all obviously, but many liberal, in the correct sense, let's say classic liberal and libertarians would say, no, no, economy is very high ranking place in our, in our vision of the world. So it's really relevant. And if you think that both in liberalism and in socialism, liberty is among the first places of their in their mind, you would say that, yeah, maybe you can say there is individualism versus collectivism, but a conservative could reply, okay, yes, but you are focused on the economy like the Marxists, so to the libertarian. So it's this is why I would say I agree with you that it's maybe there are more nuances, let's say.
Yes, I mean, something that I would say in favor of conservatism in a way, it's the fact that socialist has these sort of minds in which they have a specific idea, which is a specific, I don't know, economics idea, that it's something that you apply top down, and this is abstract because it starts from a sort of a priori idea about what society should be. And after this idea, which is at the top, it is what you apply down in the reality. I have the impression that conservatism attitude, it's something different. It's something that, in a way, it's more realistic. It starts from the down and go towards the top, the up, and in a way, what does it mean? I think that it means that when I have to propose something that could work from an economical point of view, it's something that starts from the ontological consideration about the nuances of reality, a reality which it's a sort of distinction between, for example, my moral order that cannot be divided from the moral order of people outside. And in a way, I have the impression that it consider more things that what a socialist would say. A socialist reasons more in a way which it starts from what is liberty in a sort of well, objective way that is completely detached from reality, and after try to apply it to reality. I have the impression that a conservatives think about things in a completely different way, starting from how things work in our um, social environment, what's the best way to interact with another person, what are the borders of my behavior compared to the needs of the other person in front of me, and after it start to have ideas to theorize about an order which is from down to top, and after from top to down, in a way. I don't know if it is clear what I mean.
Yeah, it's clear, and I agree. I have the same sensation, let's say, but I totally agree. And also, I think it's relevant to consider the fact that, in my opinion, it's not, let's say, not fair to associate conservatives and to socialists, uh, even because one is materialistic, as a materialistic vision of the world and of the man, of the society, of the economy. The other is exactly the opposite. So I understand that maybe there are, you can say, okay, but there are similarities. For instance, they are more oriented toward the collective, but also the individual, because the conservatives said, also in America, especially the conservative, the Anglo-Saxon conservatives, they said the individual is relevant. It's not that his liberty is not relevant or the individual is non-existent. So it's very different from socialism. But at the same time, I think that the fact that they are totally against materialism, that is the base, also the historical base of the understanding, socialist understanding of history and of economy, it's crucial. If you are anti-materialistic, you cannot be socialist. You live in the total different world.
All right. Yes.
I have a question, if it's possible.
Yeah, sure. All right. Just in time.
I have a question about the actual American Libertarian Party. So earlier that day, I read a tweet about one of the main politicians in the actual Libertarian Party in the US. It's Melissa Wong. I wonder now, after reading his post, can we actually consider ourselves as libertarian and denying the freedom of other people? Her tweets was about the actual war in Iran. I can actually understand people that oppose to that war, but also deny the sufferance of the women in Iran, calling them hookers. So I wonder now, can we actually consider ourselves as libertarian and in the same time ignoring liberty of other people?
If there is a libertarian that wants to reply, maybe it's better. Otherwise, I can give you my point of view. And your question is it's a crucial one. It's a difficult one. Okay, from a libertarian point of view, I think that there is this idea that, okay, the idea behind the isolationism inside libertarians is that if you use force, state force, to intervene abroad, you are increasing big governments at home. This was the basic reasoning. This is from a libertarian point of view. From a conservative point of view, there is more openness to this kind of issues, in the sense that, yes, the conservatives are, it's not like the neoconservatives that say, okay, let's go and bomb. The conservatives said we should be careful in what we are doing, because you should not attack anyone. And also conservatives said we should respect tradition of other people, so they tend not to use force to impose something. But there is something that I want, from a let's say philosophical point of view. So in politics it's different, but we just talk about abstract issues now. The conservatives can say, yes, we can intervene in Iran, not because we want to export freedom or democracy. That it's difficult, because you have to consider that Hayek was not wrong when he said that conservatives are skeptics about democracy. So usually conservatives will not use state force and armed force to, let's say, export democracy. But the Iranian regime was also a security threat, is also a security threat. And so a conservative can say, okay, we attack them, and when we attack, the regime will collapse, no one will cry. That's could be let's say a conservative answer. So we don't want to impose a new regime, we don't want to export democracy, but at the same time, if while we are protecting our national interests, the Ayatollah will end up badly, it's so from this point of view, I have to say that probably conservatives are more concrete when we are talking about foreign policy. And I think this is one of the most problematic aspect of libertarianism when we are discussing about foreign policy. Because, for instance, I understand the ideological reasons behind this opposition to use, for instance, Rand Paul. But at the same time, unfortunately, foreign policy is a complex realm. So, for instance, if you can decide that I don't use force, I will dismantle all my armed force and so on. But if you have countries that, on the contrary, want to use force, hacking, and so on to attack you, you have no choice. So, from this point of view, there is, I think, it's impossible in a libertarian vision of the world to solve this kind of issues. So at least I never saw someone solving this issue in a proper way. So saying, okay, what I have to do? If I increase the budget in defense, for instance, to compete against China, I'm giving more money to the state. But if I'm done doing this, China will probably become more powerful than me and will take advantage, and I will lose my, let's say, position of power in the system. How you can balance this? And in my opinion, this is one of the major issues inside libertarianism, foreign policy. So I agree with you, and I know that I went like a bit further, but coming back to your opinion, to your affirmation, you can say at least you should be in favor of the liberty of other people. That's true. Even if you don't want to use weapons, you said maybe it's better not, but for sure you should support them. Instead, what I'm seeing inside also libertarian, a part of libertarian movement in America is basically they are against the administration in favor of the Ayatollahs. This is what probably you was saying. This is problematic from a libertarian, let's say, point of view. But I don't know if I replied to your question.
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I guess that this is a nice time to wrap it up, maybe. And so thank you very much once again to Simone for joining us for his excellent talk. And we'll be in touch next week for the next sessions of the series, because next week, I remind you, we have two sessions back to back, one on March 11th and one on March 12th. So see you there, and thank you very much. Thank you again, Simone, for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice